Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth lecture in our Replatforming Deplatformed Women lecture series. It's hosted by the Cambridge Radical Feminist Network, of which I'm co-president. Also with us tonight are Phoebe Fuller, my co-president, and Imogen Galilee, who's founded the network back in 2018. Mary from Object is also going to be with us. She's giving up yet another one of her Tuesday evenings in order to handle the technical side of things. So if you notice any issues or problems, please do just flag that up to her in the chat and she'll do what she can to sort all of that out. Okay, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, but first I'm just going to go through the usual housekeeping things. Above all, please do, I hope that you'll ask lots of questions, but please, if you're on Zoom, do put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat, just because it means they're all somewhere collated and easily visible, and I'm much less likely to miss any. And we do want to get through as many of your questions as possible. If you're watching along from YouTube, you can put your questions and comments, etc., in the live chat/comments section. As usual, that's fine. The only thing I have to say about that is, do please remember that it's publicly visible. So it will be visible to anyone who's watching along, and you don't need to sign up to have done that. And it will also be part of the recording. So just bear in mind that that's a thing before you share anything personal or sensitive. That said, please do make comments, make observations, and of course make criticisms. This is a free speech event as well as a feminist one, and you're very welcome to disagree. Just please do it courteously, because Mary will be standing by with her finger on the eject button in case any of you step out of line. Okay, Imogen will be live tweeting from our official Twitter account @CamRadFems. So you can join the discussion there. If you want to do that, please use the hashtag #CamRadFems as well. I think the only other thing I have to say with regard to housekeeping is a big thank you once again to Object for letting us use their seminar platform. Of course to Mary, who I think at this point is practically an honorary CamRadFem. Thank you, Mary. And of course to the rest of the network. Ours are the faces that you see, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So thank you, all of you, especially to Eve, who's responsible for all the gorgeous promo materials and stuff that you would have seen on Facebook and Twitter. So thank you, everyone. Okay, as I say, I'm really excited to introduce Professor Kathleen Stock, OBE. She is a philosopher at the University of Sussex. She's, across the course of her career, she's contributed to various fields in her discipline. I think from philosophy of art and aesthetics to fiction and imagination to sexual objectification, that perennial issue for feminists. And I think where most of you will know her from, her work on sex, gender and gender identity. So she was deplatformed by the University of East Anglia in, I think, January of last year, where she was scheduled to give a talk on diversity and inclusion in academia. Their loss is our gain. After she made the honours list, in January of this year, over 600 of her fellow academics signed an open letter to express their quote unquote dismay. She was accused, I think, among several other things, of transphobic fear mongering. So, I mean, I'll stop talking now and I'll hand you over to Kathleen to talk on gender abolition as a goal for radical feminism.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you so much to the Cambridge Radfems for having me. I'm just really, the most inspiring thing is seeing younger generations, including younger students, female students, doing stuff for themselves and showing no fear. So I'm really happy to be part of this exciting series of events. Right, now what I'm going to do is share my screen. I don't know if people were coming here for a rabble-rousing sort of talk from me, but I'm not going to give one of those. I'm actually going to do some philosophy, which is what I do, or I should be doing. So I'm interested in the idea of gender abolition as a radical feminist goal. is something we hear quite often from radical feminists. We've heard it since the 1970s at least. So for instance, we've got this, I've got some quotes here that kind of sum up this goal in some vague way. The dream I find most compelling is one of an androgynous and genderless, though not sexless, society in which one's sexual anatomy is irrelevant to who one is, what one does, and with whom one makes love. That's Gail Rubin in The Traffic in Women in 1970s, or 1960 something, I think. Here's Shulamith Firestone writing in The Dialectic of Sex. The end goal of feminist revolution must be not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. And here's a grassroots manifesto, again, I think from the 60s or 70s, I should have checked. The feminists, it is the male role of the oppressor that must be annihilated, but because the female role is the internal adjustment of the female to the male role stabilizes the role system. Both the male role and the female role must be annihilated. So it sounds very dramatic, and it obviously sounds good to some people, including radical feminists now. However, I think there are some conceptual issues with this goal. And I'm going to argue that unless we carefully specify what we're looking for as feminists or as radical feminists, the goal is either going to be unachievable or its pursuit may well be counterproductive. So I offer this talk in the spirit of renewing or contributing a new, hopefully new kind of perspective on familiar radical feminist axioms. Okay, so now one way I could obviously go, well, I'm not going to, is to say, oh, well, we can't get rid of gender, we can't abolish gender because psychology is sexed. So some people now argue, and Deborah So has done recently, that there are distinctive, hardwired, brain innate psychological characteristics typical for members of the female sex and the male sex expressed across a range. Now that would be a reason, I think that would complicate the project of abolishing gender. However, I don't want to assume that. I'm not going to assume either way that there is sex psychology or there isn't. I'm not particularly frightened of the idea that there is sex psychology, but I do think it is an empirical question and we shouldn't decide a priori which is the case. What I'm interested in is thinking about gender abolition, even if there is no sex psychology, would it be a good thing to have? And I think the answer is, it depends. So I'm going to make some minimal naturalistic assumptions, which are not dependent on innatism about psychology. I'm going to assume radically that humans are a sexually dimorphic species and that they reproduce sexually via anisogamy, that is through the combination of two differently sized gametes produced by differently sized bodies. Males and females have, on average, distinctive body types expressed across a range, obviously, with distinctive reproductive capacities and distinctive average sizes and strengths. And I'm going to assume that heterosexuality has adaptive value for the human species, which is not to say that some degree of homosexuality does not also have adaptive value. It's just to make the pretty basic point that without widespread heterosexuality, the species would die out under normal circumstances, and unless we introduce, quite a lot of technology that I'll say something about later. So that, I think those positions, although they have obviously come to be bizarrely controversial, are not that controversial, and I'm just going to assume them. So against that background, I want to ask, what should be abolished if we're trying to abolish gender? Now, there's one version of this that I'm not, there's one version of gender abolition that I'm not going to say anything about because of my initial starting points. And this is the idea that what we should abolish is any sex-associated sociocultural difference, including the fiction that there are only two sexes. So that would be the position of Monique Wittig, who thinks that sex is socially constructed, a radical feminist from the second half of the 20th century, who thinks that sex is socially constructed. She says the category of sex is a totalitarian one. She thinks that the category of sex developed through oppression, and this is why we must destroy it and start thinking beyond it if we want to start thinking at all, as we must destroy the sexes as a sociological reality if we want to start to exist. She says things like that. And another famous person who thinks this is Judith Butler. So fair enough. If you think that the female sex and the male sex are fictions or sociocultural constructs with no material underlying basis, then you will probably think that they should be abolished or complicated in some way. But I am not going to engage with that view today, partly because I do so elsewhere, but also because I'm interested in what happens when we deny that and when we say, no, humans are sexually dimorphic, they reproduce sexually, they have distinctive, males and females have distinctive body types, different sizes and strengths and so on. It's against that background that I want to ask, is gender abolition possible and reasonable given those starting points? And if so, in what sense? Okay, so now I'm going to start introducing possible versions of gender abolition. I think they'll be familiar to you from things that radical feminists say, and I'm going to express some skepticism about some of them before ending up at a position I think is better. So the first version that I'm interested in examining is the claim that what we should be abolishing as feminists are all sex-associated sociocultural differences, like anything that's socioculturally produced. So this is the reading of gender, or the meaning of gender, which says that gender should be understood as any sociocultural aspect of biological sex. So Rubin says, the sex-gender system is the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity, and in which these transformed sexual needs are satisfied. Or if you take a textbook, a kind of student textbook about gender, more recently, gender is the structure of social relations that centers on the reproductive arena and the set of practices that brings reproductive distinctions between bodies into social processes. This is a pretty wide definition of gender, like any social difference between the sexes. So on this version of gender, gender abolition would be precisely the abolition of all and any systematic sociocultural difference between the sexes. And this is more like what Firestone is after, I think. So she says the end goal of feminist revolution must be not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. Okay, now I am skeptical that this could happen, or that it would be a good thing for it to happen. So I invite you to reflect on all the thousands of different cultural and social practices associated with females and males, cross-culturally, historically, and so on. And I came up with this just quite short list, but obviously it could go on forever. It might include things like craft circles, or Amazonian hunting parties, or suffragettes, or mother and baby groups, or lesbian butch culture, or hen nights, or school teaching, spa days, nunneries, women's sport, the women's protection units in the Syrian civil war, geishas, girl guiding, lesbian separatism, mantilla wearing in church, gossiping, pole dancing, FGM, domestic service, torch songs, romance novels, blah, blah, blah. You get the picture. Absolutely loads of stuff. This is not, just to be absolutely clear what I'm saying, I'm not saying men can't do these things, I'm not saying that women should do these things. I'm just looking at what women do, the cultural practices of women, And there's a huge range, and they differ from culture to culture and from historical period to historical period. Some of them, as I'll go on to discuss, we'll probably think are quite harmful. Some of them we will think are quite benign, and some we might think are positively beneficial. So given that context, like this is what we're talking about abolishing all of this without exception, I don't think we can. So different cultural practices associated with the female sex and the male sex, because I could have also generated a very long list for males. I didn't, because I'm focusing on females, but I think that different sex-associated cultural practices arise partly in response to the basic minimal facts I have assumed. So different shaped bodies, different strengthed bodies, different reproductive capacities, heterosexuality for many people, which forces these people into relationship with each other to reproduce. And partly in relation, these practices get generated partly in relation to other sociocultural practices already historically in place in that place. So I'm saying the forms of women and men's culture are changeable over time and place, but the fact we have different women's and men's culture is not. I cannot imagine a world in which we got rid of all that and it wasn't replaced by something else. I just don't think it's possible. But as I say, just want to be clear, because I know how I get misunderstood, that I'm not saying that there's always a clear-cut difference between male culture and female culture. I'm not saying that females can't participate in male culture. It's masculine. I'm talking about feminine and masculine. I'm not saying that men cannot participate in feminine culture and so on. So that's the first reflection, that it would be really difficult, if not impossible, to abolish all of that. I think Firestone really shows she realizes this, because she's specific about what degree of social engineering gender abolition in her sense would need. She says we'd need a reversion to unobstructed pansexuality. We'd need to, reproduction would have to occur artificially. Children would be born to both sexes equally or independently of either. I mean, I suppose, so technology would have to be involved to mediate between the mother and the child. There wouldn't be any mothers anymore, I guess. The division of labour would be ended by the elimination of labour altogether through cybernetics. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken. So she's talking about real radical intervention in the nuclear family. Now, modern feminist movements, for instance, xenofeminism, seem to approve of those goals. I think that even if technologically possible, they would be massively problematic. It would be illiberal to try and impose that sort of thing. It would be psychologically devastating for many, including children as well as parents. It would leave society with far more problems than it started with. It would require massive amounts of energy and environmental wastage, attachment problems for children, pharmaceutical effects on male bodies if we're really seriously thinking about male pregnancy, and so on. So here's a separate point. Even if we could easily somehow totally abolish feminine and masculine cultures, we should not try, because I think that cultures have positive aspects. Participation in a culture, including masculine culture or feminine culture, can be a source of meaning for an individual. It can give them an identity. It can give them a sense of purpose, feeling of achievement, camaraderie. If you think about all the sort of feminine or masculine pursuits that you yourself engage in, and think about the value that you get out of it, it can be great. And if many aspects of a person's cultural life is taken away at once, there can be profound loss. And you find, I was reading The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi. He's writing 1944, but he's talking about colonized peoples and how they lose their culture all at once, and describing it as a cultural catastrophe, where white people come and basically destroy indigenous culture and leave the people with nothing, and they lose all these sources of meaning. So I'm thinking that that is enough. We should not be aiming for the abolishment, or the abolition rather, of all sex-associated sociocultural difference. So here's a new version of the goal of gender abolition, and this says what's to be abolished are all sex-associated social norms, generally. Okay. Again, I think this will be familiar to you if you are interested in radical feminism. And here is my very good friend Holly Lawford Smith saying something like this. So she thinks that this, as far as I can tell anyway, she thinks that this is what we should be aiming to abolish. She says gender is a cage, or to be more precise, it's two cages. The cages trap people with the biological sex male and female respectively. Those of the male sex are trapped by one set of gender norms, norms of masculinity, and those of the female sex are trapped by another, norms of femininity. Gender norms are social expectations about a person's behaviour applied to their sex. I think you also find this view in Gail Rubin and many other places too. So here's Holly continuing. For example, the gender norms applied to female people include androphilia, that's attraction to males, feminine presentation, contained movements, being warm and nurturing towards others, working in care and people-focused jobs, pursuing e.g. dance or theatre rather than e.g. model building or astronomy, playing e.g. netball rather than e.g. rugby, and so on. And she makes clear she thinks as part of these gender norms is included norms about heterosexuality. Okay, and she says that we should get rid of these, all of them, because they're harmful, and they're harmful because, for two reasons. One, they lead to subordinated social roles for women and dominating roles for men. And two, they imprison the sexes in conformity and cause harm to those who don't fit the norm. Now just notice that that first one is an objection, that first sort of objection is an objection to some social roles, maybe not all of them, but that second one seems to cover all social norms, because she says they imprison, just in virtue of being a norm, it imprisons the sexes in conformity and causes harms to those who don't fit the norm. And I'm, just to cut to the punchline, I agree, I think that we should try and get rid of subordinated social roles for women. I do agree, but I mean, I'm going to have some complication about which ones those are. But I'm not so sure that just we should get rid of all norms because there are some people that don't fit them. I think that that's to misunderstand what a norm is. So I'm now going to say a bit about what a norm actually is. Okay, sorry, but before I do that, I'll just describe what Holly thinks gender abolition looks like. She says, along the gender abolition pathway, everyone repudiates their gender, understood as the set of norms they are subject to on the basis of their sex, masculinity for males or men, femininity for females and women. And at the end of this pathway, when we map the full spectrum of human behaviour, we will find that it does not cluster in significant ways according to sex. That actually sounds a bit more like the first version to me, but it certainly sounds like a very different world to the world that we live in now. And that's Holly's utopia, I think. Right, so I think we then should investigate a bit more what a social norm is. So here is a book by well, it's actually an article, but there is a book as well by Cass Sunstein that I recommend, Social Norms. His book's called Social Conformity. He says, we might very roughly understand norms to be social attitudes of approval and disapproval, specifying what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. There are social norms about littering, dating, smoking, singing, when to stand, when to sit, when to show anger, when, how, and with whom to express affection. In fact, there are social norms about nearly every aspect of human behaviour. And here is Christina Biancheri, Norms in the Wild, her book, which is also great. And she distinguishes between customs, which she says are not really social at all. Customs are shared behaviours within groups where the people participating in those behaviours have a prudential rationale. That is, they have some reason to do it that will serve themselves, like hand washing because it will stop you getting sick from germs when you eat. Then there are what she calls descriptive norms. And these are, or a descriptive norm is, a pattern of behavior such that individuals prefer to conform to it on condition that they believe that most people, let's say just most people, conform to it. So in other words, you're acting a certain way because you think other people are acting that way, which is different from hand washing because you think you want to have clean hands. Now you're hand washing because you think everyone else is hand washing. More likely examples are fashion choices, like I'm wearing these ridiculous shoes because everyone else is wearing these ridiculous shoes, or traffic light observance, arguably, or fad diets. Also coordinated acts of cooperation, like I'll help you if you help me. And then finally, social norms are, she says, a rule of behavior such that individuals prefer to conform to it on condition that they believe that most people conform to it and most people in their group basically believe they ought to conform to it. So it's not just that you think other people will do it, you think that other people will think that everyone ought to do it. And the examples here are things like queuing in the UK, being quiet at the cinema, wearing a mask during COVID is a really good example. Any kind of social prohibition against spitting or swearing or littering and fighting and so on. So wearing a mask, you're not just wearing a mask for fashion, like you're not just doing it because everyone else is doing it. Quite often you're doing it because you think everyone else is doing it and they all think you ought to do it. So there's a normative element in there. Right. And Bucheri tells us that customs, descriptive norms, and social norms can look indistinguishable from one another from the outside. So you might approve hand washing because it's hygienic or because it's rude to handshake with dirty hands. And customs can turn into descriptive norms, can turn into social norms in certain contexts. And I think a really good example actually is pronouns in email signatures. So I assume that some trans people started off putting pronouns in their email signatures or announcing their pronouns as a custom. That they did it for individual prudential reasons. They wanted people to know what their pronouns were. Then it became a fashion. It was done because other people were doing it. And then it became, in some circles, a social norm. It's done now because you think everyone else thinks you ought to, and you fear disapproval otherwise. Okay, so that's just like to go into what a social norm is in some more depth. But why do we have social norms? I think, well, I'm just borrowing this story from other people, but evolutionary psychologists think that we have norms in order to help us cooperate. And cooperation is obviously an adaptive trait. We wouldn't get very far without the ability to cooperate with one another. So, for instance, obviously it can help us like get together to build things, but it can to fight other people and to protect ourselves. But it also can, social norms can arise to manage tendencies to steal or be greedy or fight, which would otherwise divide society. So norms of disapproval can develop quite quickly to stop people behaving in ways that will destabilize a group. And social norms are good for collective action problems, like how do we get everyone to stop littering when in individual interests it's easier just to chuck the litter, you know, if you're just talking about individual interests anyway. So philosophers think and psychologists think that we are, as humans, one of our defining features is that we are profoundly pro-social. We cannot stop generating and observing social norms. We use these norms to negotiate the world around us, to cooperate with others, and so on. And it also enhances group identity and bonding between members of a group. Like if you're all bound by the same social norm, then you are bonded. Social norms get going, sometimes deliberately, like I guess with COVID and masks, but not always deliberately. So they don't have to be formally articulated or mentioned, they can just start. You can just start seeing other people doing something and you can find yourself doing it too, and then it can turn into a situation where you think you'll be disapproved of if you don't. Sometimes this, as Bicheri says, a practice starts as a purely descriptive norm and then it gets imbued with meaning, and then the meaning transcends the original function. So she talks about gang tattoos. They start off as a fashion, then they become representative of gang membership, and then it becomes really offensive for a member of a gang not to have one. So now we're in a full-blown social norm. The point of all this is to say, I don't think there is a utopia completely free of sex-associated social norms, because we cannot stop generating them. As a social species, we can't stop forming new descriptive and social norms based around the sexes or anything else. We're wired for it. So that's not a claim about sexed characteristics. That's a claim about innate social tendencies. And I assume that there will always be sex-associated norms around heterosexual courtship and mating. Given how important heterosexual courtship and mating is to the reproduction of the species, I can't see how we're going to stop generating norms about how to negotiate those relationships. If that's heteronormativity, I don't think we can escape it. Now, that's a point about not being able to get rid of social norms, but I also think that, and this is my main point really, that some sex-associated social norms are good. So we should not try and get rid of those. We should not try and abolish those. Some sex-associated norms increase the well-being of the female sex, maybe the male sex, but let's just focus on the females, and so are beneficial for that sex. So we can move from the needs of females to the oughts and the shoulds, like what should the oughts and the shoulds be given the needs? And we can move from oughts to social norms. So I'll give some examples in a minute, but first, I just think there's a whole bunch of physical facts about females which could easily and do give rise to beneficial sex-associated social norms. Most males are heterosexual, and so sexually attracted to females, and vice versa. Now that has consequences for you as a female, as you know. If most males are heterosexual, then there is a consequence for females, whether or not you're sexually attracted back. Males are on average physically stronger than females. Only women can get pregnant, menstruate, have PMT, go through menopause, female menopause, and so on. Men and women tend to get different kinds of illnesses. Sometimes they get the same illnesses, but sometimes they get different kinds of illnesses or different severity of illness, different prognoses, and so on. Some drugs work differently on men and women. Men and women have different pain thresholds. These are all claims on average. As we all know, if you know if you've been following me or others in this series, post-pubertal men and women have different average strengths, sizes, wingspans, twitch muscles, lung capacities, and limb lengths. And men and women process alcohol differently, etc. So you could keep going on a list of differences physically between men and women on average. And these might well give rise to sex-associated social norms to do with sexed well-being. So here might be some examples of beneficial sex-associated norms. And I think this is the most obvious one. It is a social norm that there are single-sex changing rooms and showers. Sex-separated spaces where women, on average smaller and weaker than men, where men have a sexual interest in women, can undress and sleep and thereby reduce their exposure to sexual assault. So that's a social norm. Like most of the people who go into the ladies, most of the women that go into the ladies don't go in because they've worked out it's better for them. They just go in because they think they'll be disapproved of if they go into the men's and vice versa. But that social norm works very well, or used to. Women-only refuges where triggers for trauma for women rape victims are reduced. Women-only sports teams or competitions. Norms that it's dishonorable for a man to hit a woman. That's a good norm for women, I think. So what I'm saying is just because these have a rationale in terms of sex-based well-being doesn't mean they aren't social norms. I think most people observing these norms, like choosing which sports team they play on, which shower room they go into, are not doing it because they've worked out that rationale. They're just doing it almost unthinkingly because they have become subject to the social norm. Okay, upshot so far. I'm saying some sex-associated social norms are beneficial. In fact, the very ones that radical and gender-critical feminists are fighting to save. So we shouldn't abolish all of them, even if we could. So which should we abolish? Okay. So in the remaining time, which is, I haven't got that long to go, but I will just go through some possible answers to the question, which social norms should we as feminists try to abolish? And here's an answer I don't think really works. We should abolish any norms which promote difference of treatment for men and women. Now, I don't think that's true because I think we've already seen that we've got sexual difference. There may well be differences of treatment which enhance women's well-being, appropriately different social norms for each group. You could say the same thing about men, by the way. I mean, I'm rehearsing this argument for the female sex, but there may be social norms that benefit the male sex too, specifically. So it would be distorting to try and get equality or to try and reduce, to make sure that the norms are always the same for some arbitrary reason when males and females are different. Similarly, I don't think the aim should be to abolish any norms which promote inequality if inequality just means different treatment. I mean, obviously inequality itself is a very vague term and can be cashed out in a number of ways, but one way it shouldn't be cashed out is in thinking that equality must just mean pursuing equality of norms for men and women in some identical sense, because we could easily that way lose several norms of value to women in particular, for instance, in gender neutral policies. So here's a better answer. We should abolish any norms which promote power imbalances between women and men, or which promote the subordination of women and the domination of men. I think that's closer. It's certainly, for many examples, true, I think, but I think it's still a bit problematic because it can make it sound like a zero-sum game. It can make it sound like every time you've got a sex-associated social norm which empowers men, it must disempower women, or vice versa. So, and I don't think that's true. I think it's often true, not always true. So some norms could be good for both sexes for different reasons, or good for one sex and neither good nor bad for the other sex. This example, it's not my example, you might disagree with it, but anthropologists talk about the utility of the social norm of monogamy. They say it's good for men because it regulates male aggression, and it's good for women because it provides support in the context of reproduction. So I don't know whether or not you agree with that example. It's an example, if it worked, that would show that there was at least one norm that was good for males and good for women for different reasons. So it's not always a zero-sum game. So here's my preferred version. We should abolish sex-associated norms that undermine well-being for the female sex. Now, I suppose you could say by parity, we should also abolish sex-associated norms that undermine well-being for the male sex. I think that's probably true, but my focus is on the female sex. So there are obviously loads of customs and norms which undermine women's well-being specifically. For instance, the norm that women should be treated as sexual objects for men's pleasure, women should not be educated, women should not wear revealing clothes, women should wear revealing clothes. So I think both of those norms are bad for women. Women should wear clothes that restrict their movement through space. Women should be submissive and responsive to the needs of men. Women should be subject to FGM as children, and so on and so on. So I think what's wrong with these is not because they are unequal in some vague sense, it's because they undermine the well-being of women and girls. However, even then, I think that's not the end of the story, because once we're faced with one of those norms, we've got two options. We can aim on abolishing the norm, the sort of offensive norm that undermines well-being, or we can try and abolish the consequences of the norm. So we can try and abolish the social consequences that follow from the norm being observed. And I think which we do is going to depend on the case. Like, how much effort would it take to change the norm? What else would have to change? What would be the political reality of trying to do that? What are the consequences of those changes, knock-on effects for other things? Versus what would it take to mitigate the consequences of the norm, but leave the norm? So what would have to change and what would be the consequences of that? And I think very often it'd be preferable to tackle the norm head on, but sometimes it might be preferable to leave the norm and tackle the consequences of the norm. So an example where I think we need to tackle the norm is sexual objectification. Like women, the norm that women should be sexual objects for men's pleasure. I can't imagine a world in which we could leave that norm in place and just try and mitigate the harm in some way. Now, I think that campaigns within feminism, like the Slut Walk campaign, or the idea that prostitution and porn is empowering and liberating, are basically attempts to leave the norm of sexual objectification and compensate somehow for the obvious detrimental effects it has on women. But I don't think you can do it. I just don't think, I mean, I think these attempts manifestly fail now, and they fail because the norm is so harmful that there's not much you could do. I mean, it basically dehumanizes women and turns them into objects. So there's just not much you can do to mitigate that devastating fact, which has consequences for loads of other areas of their lives. However, just to leave you with something to argue with me about, I think there are other cases where arguably it might be better on focusing on offsetting the damage of the norm rather than abolishing the norm. So here's an example. Here's a norm. Women who have young children should look after them as opposed to paying others to do it, right? You could say, oh, that norm's very oppressive and it stops me doing what I want and we should abolish it. But actually, I think that norm has benefits for well-being of mothers and children. And I say that as somebody who sent my children to daycare from 6 months on. So I'm not standing in any, there's no judgment implied in this. But if we're looking at what norms we want to keep and what norms we want to get rid of, I'm saying I don't think all norms are equally bad, and that some of them have a role to play in well-being. And so what we should probably do is try and I'm not saying this should ever be compulsory either, I want to make that clear, it's a norm, it's not a law, but what we should probably do as feminists is try and offset the economic damage that accompanies women who have young children staying at home to look after them and being removed from the workplace. I mean, I think there are many statistics which show that most women with young children do not want to work. So I don't think I'm saying anything that it might be anathema to some feminists, but it's not that controversial amongst most women. But this would be an example where you don't tackle the norm as such, but you do think about the harmful effects of the norm and see if you can mitigate that. So I'm saying that I think there's no straightforward story about which of those things we should do, and we should argue about it, obviously, and look at evidence as well, because that will have a role to play in this discussion. But I hope in this talk I have, I don't know, raised a few complications for the relatively easy story that we should just abolish gender as feminists. So I'll stop there.
Gosh. Thank you so much for that, Kathleen.
Okay.
Thanks for that, yeah, characteristically sort of systematic and methodical approach to the issue. It's refreshing given how much heat and how little light there often is around this stuff. There's going to be a lot of paper rustling now because I'm going to try and balance I've got so many notes, I've got so many questions that people have sent in, plus my notes on this. So if we start with a relatively general question, and then we've had a few questions relating to the different versions that you've sort of laid out for us. So I'll try and go through it fairly systematically like that. And then if there are a few questions relating to kind of trans issues, and if we have time, then we'll do that at the end. But okay. So the first sort of quite general question is whether gender abolition is a problem for the West only, and how all of this kind of applies cross-culturally. Even if feminists are able to convince the general public to abandon the notion of gender and gender stereotypes, is this particular movement irrelevant to women in other countries who arguably suffer more oppressive forms of discrimination than the relatively free West? In other words, does gender abolition as a goal help women all over the world, or only women here? That's a question from YouTube. Thanks for that.
Wow, okay. Well, firstly, I just want to point out, as you probably noticed, I didn't say anything about stereotypes. I think there is there's a second talk about whether we could abolish stereotypes. And I think the answer to that is no too, because I think stereotypes in general are like mental heuristics that help us out basically by predicting quickly when we need to. So I think we're hardwired to have stereotypes as well. However, we can try and combat particularly damaging stereotypes. Now, whether in answer to the question of like whether this is a Western problem, not the way it's presented, like initially anyway, I was presenting it on behalf of radical feminists as a goal for everyone. I think like we should just get rid of the whole lot. There should be just these androgynous societies where there are males and there are females, but there's no masculine culture or feminine culture. I think that ambition is probably held by the ones radical feminists that have it for everyone, and they think it's a way of liberating people from oppressive masculine cultures or feminine cultures. But I think my view is it's in that broad sense it's equally it's equally wishful thinking, whether it's about the global South or England. It just can't be done. So we have to decide as feminists which norms we want to keep and which ones we get rid of, which stereotypes are harmful, which are beneficial. I think some are beneficial, some are harmful. What I do think is that in the global South, they need to have those conversations for themselves. What we really don't want is, Western feminists coming along and saying, I know which norms are best for you, because actually, as I hope the end of my discussion showed, I think getting into the nitty-gritty of this stuff is where you can't make a quick decision. You're going to have to look at empirical consequences and how they stack up against other empirical consequences. It's going to be really complicated. So we're going to need people who know what they're talking about locally. And it might be a different answer for them than for us. That's the other thing. I don't think there's any universal norms.
Yeah, I think that's something that really came out of your talk, is the idea that norms are adaptive. So presumably it's going to vary a lot by context and environment, whether they're desirable or beneficial. Okay, that's great. So yeah, I've got a few questions that I think kind of came up, and then you sort of address them within the talk. So if we go all the way to what I'm thinking of as version 3, which would be the version where we have these practices and these norms, but they're not necessarily associated with either sex. I've got a question from David, so I'll just read it out. He asks, because he's observed that within gender norms, there's a hierarchy based on how well members of a sex conform to the norms. But women seem to adopt masculine norms, such as, I think, assertiveness, because it's an advantage within their sex, whereas men don't tend to adopt feminine norms, presumably because there's not much of an advantage to doing so. Although, of course, we see that's not the case necessarily when in the kind of gender ideology debate. I think from the phrasing of this question, David seems to conclude that this means that we should abolish gender. But what are your thoughts about this, if any? Sorry if that was a slightly confused formulation.
No, it's well, I don't agree that men don't adopt feminine norms. I mean, it depends on the cultural context, and it depends on the subculture as well. I mean, there's a whole bunch of male subcultures where it's really important to sort of show femininity in various contexts. The thing about hierarchy is there, so I think you said that there's a hierarchy within a cultural practice depending on how well you meet the norms for your sex. I mean, bearing in mind that I'm saying that some norms are good and some norms are bad. So obviously, if the norm is you should be stick thin, blonde, gorgeous, heterosexual, you know, then lots of people are not going to meet that. I don't think that's a particularly good norm to retain. But I don't think I disagree with David about that. But what I'm trying to say is that you can't really make a blanket pronouncement about all norms. Like they function differently. Some of them are quite good. Some of them, as I point out, radical feminists are actually fighting to keep right now, and they serve us well. So
yeah,
I want a bit more complexity.
I think there's an interesting point in there about norms as well, about how, and about conformity to norms, how sort of having extreme conformity, as in the example that you gave of meeting feminine beauty standards sort of really well. There are obviously advantages to that in some respects, but then there are also massive disadvantages to that as well. So it seems like kind of the key thing coming out of all of this is just the importance of like nuance in having these discussions about what to retain and what not to.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me of a point that I didn't get a chance to make, but I think it also, this discussion should lend itself to a certain kind of strategic approach by feminists. So I think if feminists forget that women get a lot of identity, meaning, and purpose out of even oppressive norms, you know, I just think it's true. Like, there are some cultures or some cultural aspects of femininity that you really think, on the whole, are really not good for women, but nonetheless, they still enjoy some bits of them. They still get identity out of them. They still get purpose and meaning out of them. So for other feminists to come along and say, you should just abolish that, it's not going to go down well. So we have to meet people where they are, which is quite often immersed adaptively in maybe overall harmful context, but one that they are attached to.
Yeah.
We need to recognize that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I won't talk for too long. I'll get on to the next question, but I'm doing my dissertation on surrogacy at the moment, and it's a brilliant example where, from the radical feminist perspective, surrogacy is, you know, obviously kind of inherently harmful. But I'm reading the accounts of surrogates, and you can look at it from the radical feminist perspective, but however you slice it, sort of subjectively from the women involved, even if it has harmful effects on their lives and on their well-being, their subjective kind of view of it is that it is a brilliant thing and that it's a massive part of their identity. And it's difficult as a radical feminist kind of reading and making judgments about this to do so in a way that isn't kind of like belittling or failing to acknowledge actually that's how they're experiencing it, regardless of the broader kind of social implications or whatever else. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Okay.
It's very hard. It makes this discussion very hard.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, on the same kind of conception of gender abolition, so assuming that we are going to pursue gender abolition to some extent, or pursue this kind of, or we're going to try and abolish and change something, how can we retain the desirable or beneficial norms? I think this is more of a practical question. Like, do you think there's a way that we can try and change society and do things as feminists, but we manage to sort of retain the desirable stuff, the ones that protect vulnerable women or relate to safeguarding, but also change things, if that makes sense, if we can't do things in a blanket way?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, isn't it? And I'm not sure I have the answers, but I think two things come to mind. One is that we should triage. Right, I think another problem with contemporary feminism, not necessarily radical feminism actually, but like, you know, the whole shebang, is that huge amounts of attention get paid to relatively small problems affecting middle class women, and there are much graver problems affecting women. Sexual objectification seems to me like the obvious one, like an objectifying culture, pornified culture is a huge problem for everyone. So I think we should all put our thoughts into that, and we should also focus on the women, not tell the best possible story about a social norm, but always look at the people lower down the economic ladder, or whoever or whatever, for whom sex work isn't empowering. It is dehumanizing and intolerable. So, for instance, so that's one thought. But the other thought I have is that another thing I didn't really say is, but I think it does follow from what I think, is that if I think men and women are different, they can come to accommodations, and they do, but our interests are different, I think, given our different bodies, our different reproductive capacities, and to some extent and because they are stronger, and because they sort of dominate certain areas, you know, in the workplace, in politics or whatever, women as a sex face extra challenges and I don't think we should ever let our guard down. Their interests are not our interests. not really. So we are just going to have to keep talking about our interests, which of course will differ. And I'm not saying that this doesn't get inflected by other cultural identities as well.
Yeah.
I want to make that clear.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think my attempts at structuring this Q&A are sort of being exploded by the loads of questions that are still coming in. So I'm just going to jump around all over the place. So here's one. This is, again, a practical one. Ellie wants to know what you think the best way to deal with these kind of newly emerging social norms like pronouns and email signatures is. For example, it makes perfect sense for someone to state their pronouns if they so wish, but there is so much pressure now to follow suit. If you don't, you're often questioned or accused of sort of being nefarious in some way.
Yeah. Well, I can definitely answer this one. So I recommend, maybe an unusual answer, but I recommend you read a book on social norms. And I think Cass Sunstein's book, Social Conformity, is really good because it gives you all this insight into why we're doing that. And he has this idea, or just read a summary or whatever, but he has this idea, which Christina Bicheri also has a version of. I think she came first as well. Anyway, I'll say it the way he says it because it's the way I remember it. He talks about informational cascades or reputational cascades, which is where basically people start doing things because everyone else is doing them. And it can happen really quick. And at a certain point you start assuming, well, there's probably a good reason why they're all doing it. And so I'd better do it too. And they'll disapprove me if I don't do it. And it can happen really quickly. And it can get to the point really quickly where everybody is doing it because they think everyone else knows why they're doing it. But in fact, nobody knows why they're doing it. And if you get these people privately and say, do you really want to put pronouns on your, they'll say, no. And I don't even know why I'm doing it, but I'm doing it because everybody else is doing it. And I think I'll get disapproved of if I don't. So I think we need, in the case of pronouns, it's a really good example. I think half the people with pronouns do not know why. Or they have a vague idea they're being supportive in some way, but they don't really know why they're doing it. So you should not assume that everyone else understands. They're just often, we're just wired to follow quite often.
Yeah.
Also, in this book, he points out the power of the early dissenter. And I think you can see that in the discussions that have been had around women's rights and sex-based rights. The power of someone standing up and saying, I'm not going to do it, gives an example for everyone else to go, oh, well, maybe I don't have to do it either. And then these reputational and informational cascades can just disappear. So I know it's hard, but the more people that say, I don't want to do that, the less there'll be pressure on you to do it. And it could happen quite quickly. There can be quite quick tipping points where suddenly nobody's doing it anymore. And I think if you read that book or something like it, you get an insight into this stuff and how it works. Because we need to know how to change the norms. Like if I'm right, we need practical, you know, insight into how to do it.
Yeah, this is where I plug my own subject of psychology and say, yes,
yes,
they're very useful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really talking psychology rather than philosophy, I think, but I think the two are mixed up in this issue. I mean, I guess practically speaking, if you want to know, like, what do I say? I say nothing. So the round goes, you know, there's a pronoun round, and somebody beside me says, I'm so-and-so, and my pronouns are she and her, and I say, and I'm Kathleen. And then I look at the person to my left. That's what I do.
I suppose it's actually it's a really optimistic way of thinking about it, actually, I suppose, because it's easy to focus on how quickly we seem to have arrived at this slightly frightening point, and it's nice to think that actually the mechanisms which underpin that can equally go the other way, and hopefully we can get out of this a little bit quicker than we thought.
Yeah, I mean, we want to be careful as well, I think, as responsible people, that we don't end up setting situations where the social norms get out of control in some other damaging way for some other group. So
yeah,
you know, I choose not to announce my pronouns. I don't mind if someone else does, as long as it's a matter of free choice. I think the situation is difficult is where people are doing it because they feel they have to, and usually, and even worse, where they feel that institutions compelled them to. And that's the really problematic situation.
No, absolutely. And to offset that sort of optimistic moment with quite a pessimistic question, Alice would like to know, one of the key problems in attempting to change norms is that in my now cynical second wave feminist perception, however we change things, whatever success we have, the patriarchy or underlying dynamic will always find a new way to create a pattern that keeps women in a worse position, just differently. And that's not so much a question as an upsetting statement. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, my other talk could have been why I think we should need to revise concepts of the patriarchy, but I think I get what you're saying. I just think there's a new story to be said about patriarchy. I find the idea of patriarchy as a totalizing explanation. It doesn't work for me, but there are certainly areas of power which are male dominated, and they are a big obstacle to us doing what we're doing. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really say anything that.
Fair enough. So here's one from YouTube. I know in your talk you kind of specifically excluded the kind of empirical side at first to focus on the ideas, but this is a question that asks about, I suppose, from a philosophical standpoint, how to deal with the fact that some people make these claims about behavioral innatism. As a philosopher, like, how would you address that complaint?
Right.
That claim.
Well, I mean, again, I offer this in the spirit of sort of friendly criticism to the radical feminist tradition, but I think that the radical feminist tradition has handled that possibility really badly, because second wave feminists basically said, if it were true that there were sex psychological characteristics, we would be stuck in the kitchen, stuck in the nursery, kept out of education. So it can't be true. I mean, that doesn't make sense as an argument. It might be true, even if those consequences, social consequences, follow, but they would be social consequences. They wouldn't be inevitable. So in other words, I'm saying, I'm not that scared of the idea that there are sex psychological characteristics. I don't know if there are, because I'm not an empirical scientist, but if there are, I don't see that it's a total disaster for us. And I'm generally, this is sort of taking me into areas that I don't really have time to explain, but I'm not a liberal feminist. And the idea of liberal feminism seems to be a bit like gender abolition, sort of strip back everything that's different about us. So you've just got this kind of human, rational, androgynous core, which is usually male, in a smuggled in way. And I just don't really buy that either. So I don't think we should be frightened of the idea that there are sex characteristics psychologically. I don't think if there either are or there aren't.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like, I know there's an awful lot of effort put into showing that there absolutely could not be under any circumstances, but you know, there either are or there aren't. And then the question is what social world we produce as a result.
Yeah, Maya Forstater made a very similar kind of point 2 weeks ago, and I think it's a good one. So we have another sort of question vaguely about innatism. So Peter says, you say that if you hold an innatist view like Deborah So's, gender abolition is a non-starter. It seems to him, though, that the innatist view is compatible with some of the versions of gender abolitionism you discuss, at least in principle. He says he's thinking of Lawford Smith's version of gender abolitionism.
Yeah, that's true, actually. In the sense that even if some psychological characteristics are sexed, it won't, you know, that won't get us to some social norms are hardwired or anything like that. So it will still leave huge amounts of the social world completely contingent and flexible and changeable. And I think that's a point that feminists should take heart from, in a way, because the ones that are really worried about this hardwired stuff, because everything physical expresses itself in conjunction with the social and changeable, including our bodies. So there's nothing that's just purely nature and purely nurture. It's all some kind of combination of the two. Anyway.
Okay. Well, again, we'll jump around a bit. Ram would like to know how or whether you think feminists can avoid the charge of paternalism towards women when they criticize the enactment of harmful sexist norms such as prostitution, sexual objectification, and porn.
Well, they can't avoid the criticism, because they'll get criticized for anything they do, any means necessary to get them to shut up. But, you know, whether it would be a just criticism is a different issue. I'm afraid again, because I am I'm really allergic to general principles anyway, so as a philosopher, so I'm just not going to have a quick answer, oh, you do it like this. I think you're always going to have to get down into the detail. Sometimes it's going to be really, really obvious, I think. Things like, say, choking during sex, which is a kind of norm that's developed through porn. I don't think it takes much to see that that is harmful to women. I don't think it's paternalistic to tell an adolescent girl that she doesn't need to be choked, and that wanting to be choked is probably not a good idea for her. You know, on the other hand, there are lots of other social norms where it's a lot more difficult, and when you get into cultural differences, it becomes even more difficult. So I think hard conversations, I think, you know, open listening, it's quite often about style, and I don't know, I don't have any easy answers, but I definitely don't think we can avoid the conversations. And I think part of the problem of modern life is that we're just so disconcerted by the discomfort of having those conversations, that as soon as someone says, well, I feel, you know, I really like sex work, or I really like choking, you go, oh, okay, fine, you know, I'll leave you to it then. And that's just not responsible either. So just going to have to get in there and try.
Yeah, and this is something I've thought a lot about, like coming into radical feminism and beginning to criticize sort of prostitution and sex work within a space where you're not really supposed to in student politics. And I've been reading Kathleen Stock, so I'd just like to contribute something that she says, which is that she makes the point that when this taboo around calling a woman a victim when she's been victimized relies on the assumption that the opposite of victim isn't perpetrator but subject. So her argument is essentially that there shouldn't actually be anything wrong with acknowledging that someone has been victimized, or saying that she is a victim, however uncomfortable it is to say that. And I find it incredibly difficult. And also, I wouldn't, in most contexts, if I was talking to someone, I wouldn't say you're a victim. But in kind of academic discussions about this, yeah, I'm just plugging Kathleen Stock because I think she's brilliant. But I'll move on to the next question. Kind of in a similar vein, do you think that norms within feminism can be oppressive if women feel they're failing as feminists because they choose to stay at home with their children or pursue a stereotypically feminine job.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that. Do I think... I missed the beginning of the question.
Oh, sorry, I think I cut out briefly. So Sheena asks whether you think that norms within feminism can be oppressive too.
Oppressive, I mean, they can be wrong. They can, I mean, norms within feminism is just the norms that feminists come up with, and there's usually disagreement about what they are anyway. It's like, as you know, there's no real agreement across feminism. I think, yeah, I mean, I think feminists can get it wrong, like every other human being.
Yeah. I don't know if everyone can still hear me because I cut out there for a second. Am I back? Am I okay?
You're back.
Okay, fab. I'm sorry about that. It's the sort of hazards of doing things over Zoom. Okay, well, let's see where we are. Okay. So David asks finally, is it not better to see all of this as a balance of factors rather than it becoming a divisive issue with kind of men and women sort of either in opposition or complementing each other?
Well, it might be better to see it that way, but I think it would be the wrong way to see it that, because, you know, as I've argued, I think males and females are physically different, and that gives rise to different facts about what's good for males and good for females. So it would be nice if we all lived in an androgynous utopia, maybe. Would it be that nice?
I don't think so.
I mean, I'm gay, so I don't know, but it might. The point is, if I'm right, that utopia just cannot happen, and we are to some extent always divided because we're different.
Yeah.
So it's just the way it is, which isn't to say that we can't negotiate, compromise, have conversations, but it's just to get rid of the idea that if we could just get rid of all the social cultural differences and somehow we'd all get along. I just think that's a fantasy. I think it's a liberal fantasy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a question from Imogen, our founder. So I'll try and fit that in. She says she believes that there is a definition of harmful discrimination that says it is discrimination between two groups on the basis of something that is not morally relevant. It may be that the argument that gender should be absolutely abolished may have this unspoken caveat, that it is useful almost as a thought experiment. The norms we should accept should be accepted on the basis that each human being is being treated as having equal value. Treating human beings as having equal value necessitates an awareness of physical differences. So gender abolition seems to be useful more as a reminder for us to focus upon that question. What treatment of this individual is required by virtue of the fact that I accept this person has equal value to any other person? The utopia envisaged is one where norms in a society exist on the basis that male and female people have equal value. Does the radical feminist theory you are criticizing make more sense, or does it not, when we understand it more as a utopian thought experiment?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to cop out slightly and say I think I do need to think about that. But a couple of thoughts. One is, yes, undoubtedly it works better taken as some kind of illustrative thought experiment than as a literal project, I think. The stuff about equal value, I mean, this isn't going to be very coherent because it's just off the top of my head, but the way that I see things right now anyway, and this is a kind of part of the emerging project, as they say, like this, I want to write a book about sort of rethinking quite a lot of axioms in radical and liberal feminism. But the way I see it is that women have an interest in the well-being of women, and men have an interest in the well-being of men. And then I suppose as like wives and mothers, we have an interest, you know, we have sons, so we have an interest in the well-being of sons. But, you know, there's no automatic assumption that humans should just be interested in the well-being of everybody equally. So now that's obviously a departure from many liberal traditions, and it's sort of so I think that the way I've just set it out is slightly in tension with the way that you just put it, Imogen, which seemed to start from the position that we've all got equal value, each sex has equal value, and then we have, you know, so as a woman, I have a responsibility to recognize the value of men just as much as I do towards the value of women. So that's quite a sort of, you know, liberal Enlightenment project style approach. I'm not saying, I mean, obviously has many advantages in terms of political arrangements. It sounds good and it is good in many ways, but I'm not sure it fits with the way that I'm seeing things.
Yeah. Imogen has another sort of slightly shorter question / comment that I think she'd be interested in knowing what your thoughts are about. She says, you say that we should meet people where they are to the extent that they are enmeshed in cultural norms and get an identity from them. The problem is that people get identity from all kinds of objectively harmful practices, even something like depression and drug use. It seems like quite a handicap on a progressive movement to say that if somebody gets in some sense an emotional benefit from conformity to a harmful norm, that we should be reluctant to criticize that or to believe the norm has more value as a result. I would question.
I didn't say that, Imogen. I said we need to psychologically, if we're strategizing, recognize that fact and factor it into the way we deal with things. I absolutely am not saying that that's the end of the conversation and we just notice it and go, okay, now I need to back off. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that sometimes radical feminists and feminists generally steam in, you know, shooting their mouths off about things where they do not recognize that the women involved like those things and that means that strategically it's not going to work, telling them off. That's really the point I was making.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially in terms of something like conformity to Western sort of beauty norms and practices, because I think quite a lot of younger radical feminists in particular can initially feel quite alienated by some of the focus on giving up that stuff. And I'm not criticizing the arguments behind that, but it's maybe a little bit alienating and not the priority in these situations.
So there's different ways to do it, and I think consciousness raising actually is a brilliant tool because it engages people in thinking for themselves about what really is their life is like, and like admitting to themselves things that they authentically admit, as opposed to just being told are bad for them by others. So I'm not saying there aren't contexts where you can get people to recognize the damage, just saying it's not that, you know, anyway, you can see what I'm saying.
No, absolutely, yeah. So I think this has sort of flown by, but I'll ask, we've got two questions relating to sort of the relationship between power and norms. Well, I'll ask you that and then we'll end it there. So they're both broadly similar. Someone from YouTube would like to know, they're interested in how Kathleen understands power / struggle / resistance in the getting rid of norms. What does getting rid mean? And a similar question on Zoom, the underlying hardware of sexual inequality is the getting of power. It hasn't grown in relation to well-being of the subordinate group, and I suspect won't be susceptible to dialogue about fairness and well-being. Can you comment on the relationship between norms and power?
Yeah, I mean, I do think I'm afraid I've got a quite depressing sort of view on that. I don't think there's a future in which this all gets sorted out. I think it's like going to be a perpetual agonistic struggle. I don't really know what to do with that. You know, I know that's not what feminists want to hear. Anyway, you don't have to listen to me. I'm sure I don't know what I'm talking about, but I do personally don't have any kind of view that if we could only like overthrow this or get, you know, reprogram everyone that way. I just think the fundamental physical facts of sexual dimorphism put us at odds with each other in ways that the odds are stacked against women from the start. Yeah, so I really need to work on my positive message at the end.
On that note, yeah, I think that's really interesting, given that the focus of your talk has been about gender abolition as a goal for radical feminism. In light of sort of these more practical questions about power and norms, I suppose that's a topic for another lecture or panel, but it would be interesting to talk about what the goals of radical feminism should be if gender abolition isn't, perfect.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Yeah, so that's we'll definitely be asking you back. So, yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over in a second to Phoebe to just talk about next week and also sort of ask you for money as usual, everyone. But thank you so much for that, Kathleen, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. It's been great and really interesting.
Thanks so much. Thank you for all your questions.
Sorry, my internet's really rubbish. Thanks, Kathleen. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. Yeah, so obviously we've got the link to our PayPal and our Twitter bio, and you've all been really generous, but there's a few people that could really use your support. The first being Kira Bell, and the second being Raquel Rosario Sanchez, who we mentioned last week. So if you've got anything to spare, please do give to them. We've had a bit of a last minute change for our talk next week. It won't be Selena Todd. It'll be Heather Brunskill Evans who'll be giving a talk. Hopefully we'll be able to talk to Selena and she can go ahead with her original talk at some point in the near future, but we're not sure when yet. So, but we're sure that Heather will be just as interesting. There won't be another sign up link. It'll just be the same one, just so that we don't have to get registrations all over again. But so if you do want to come along to that, there'll be more details about it on our Twitter soon. Thank you very much. So yeah, I think we're just about done. If that's everything, Sophie, Mary, if you want to close down the Zoom, but thanks everyone for coming.